What if I told you that the greatest empire in history began to die, not from an external enemy, but from its own blindness, and that the day that paved the way for its demise was just as ordinary a summer morning as thousands before it? On August 9th, 378, under the scorching Thracian sun, two forces that should never have met in open battle clashed on the dusty plains near Adrianople. On one side was Rome, accustomed to dictating terms to the world. Its legions marched under the command of Emperor Valens himself, confident, even smug, convinced of his right to victory. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how one overconfident decision by Emperor Valens, one mistaken belief in his own invincibility, led to the Roman army being surrounded, destroyed, and left on the field in such silence that all of Europe heard it, and why Adrianople was not just a disaster, but a turning point after which Rome was never the same again. I will reveal to you a secret that historians often overlook. The catastrophe of 378 did not begin on the battlefield, but 2 years earlier, with a humanitarian mission that went completely off-plan. In the second half of the 4th century, the Roman world, which seemed unshakable, faced a threat that came from the depths of Asia. This spectre was the Huns, a fierce nomadic force that swept away everything in its path, building no cities and leaving nothing but ashes behind. Their tactics of warfare were alien to the European peoples and instilled a primal fear. They did not fight in formation, but swooped down like a storm, showering their enemies with clouds of bone-tipped arrows. The Gothic tribes, who had lived north of the Danube for centuries, were defenseless against this relentless force. The Huns descended on their lands, destroying their way of life. An entire people, consisting of the Trivings and Grevingi tribes, was forced to flee. They retreated until they reached the greatest frontier of the ancient world, the Danube River. On the other side lay the Roman Empire, the only bastion of civilization and order that could save them from destruction. The leader of one of the largest groups, the Thracians, was Fritigern. He was a cunning and far-sighted politician who understood both the power of Rome and the desperate situation of his people. In 376, he sent envoys to Valens, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was not a request from a conqueror, but a plea from refugees. Fritigern asked the emperor to allow his people to cross the Danube and settle on the lands of the empire as allies, or federates. The Goths were ready to provide Rome with what it had always needed, recruits for the army. They promised to remain loyal to the emperor and defend the empire's borders from other barbarians. In exchange, they asked only for land to settle on and protection from the Huns. For Fritigern, this was the only chance to save his people from complete annihilation. He offered Rome a deal that, at first glance, seemed beneficial to both sides. Emperor Valens, who was in his eastern capital of Antioch at the time, thought long and hard about this proposal. His empire was fighting a grueling war with Persia, and the army needed reinforcements. The prospect of getting tens of thousands of seasoned warriors without spending money on recruiting them seemed incredibly tempting. Valens saw the Goths not as a threat, but as a valuable human resource that could be used to strengthen his own power and military might. The decision was made. Fritigern's Goths were allowed to enter the empire. However, Valens set a condition. They had to surrender all their weapons and be resettled in different provinces so that they would not pose a unified force. This was standard Roman assimilation practice, which had worked for centuries. The emperor was confident that he would be able to control the situation by turning desperate refugees into submissive subjects and loyal soldiers. Roman officials organized a crossing over the Danube. Tens of thousands of people, warriors, old men, women, crossed the wide river in boats and rafts, leaving their old lives behind. They looked at the Roman shore with hope, believing that their trials were over. They did not yet know that instead of salvation, a new nightmare awaited them, created by the very people from whom they sought protection. This moment marked the beginning of a chain of tragic mistakes. The Roman administrative machine, once efficient, began to malfunction. Accepting and accommodating such a huge number of people required flawless logistics, honesty, and resources. Valens had none of these things. He entrusted the operation to his local officials in Thrace. These officials, in turn, saw the situation not as a humanitarian crisis, but as an opportunity for personal enrichment. They were supposed to provide food and land, but instead began to shamelessly profit from their misfortune. This corruption became the powder keg that would soon explode across the entire province. Valens' mistake was not military, but administrative. He underestimated both the greed of his own subordinates and the limits of the patience of an entire people. The beginning of the end was not brought about by the sword, but by bureaucratic indifference and greed. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. Do you think the peaceful resettlement of the Goths could have been successful in principle, or was conflict inevitable in any case? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about how two Roman officials turned potential allies into mortal enemies? After crossing the river, the Goths were placed in temporary camps along the southern bank of the Danube, under the strict supervision of Roman troops. These troops were commanded by two men, the Count of Thrace, Lupicinus, and the Count of the Domestics, Maximus. The fate of tens of thousands of people was in their hands, and they did not fail to take advantage of it. First, Lupicinus and Maximus failed in their task of disarming the Goths. They were supposed to confiscate their weapons in exchange for food. But corruption did its job. For bribes, the Gothic leaders were able to keep their best swords and spears. At the same time, Roman officials began to openly rob the refugees, taking away their last possessions. Then famine set in. The Roman authorities were either unable or unwilling to provide the promised supplies. The warehouses were empty, and Lupicinus and Maximus held back the food that was delivered. They created an artificial shortage in order to sell food to the Goths at exorbitant, speculative prices. Very soon, despair reigned in the refugee camps. The people who had escaped the Huns now found themselves in a new trap. They had no food, no land, and no freedom of movement. Roman soldiers treated them as prisoners, not allies. Sources describe horrific scenes in which the Goths were forced to give up everything they had for the smallest piece of bread. The cynicism of Roman officials reached such heights that they created a disgusting market. They demanded not only gold and valuables from the Goths in exchange for food, people themselves were also used as currency. Desperate parents were forced to give their loved ones into the service of the Romans just to get a little food and save the rest from starvation. Fritigern saw his people's patience wearing thin. He tried to negotiate, called Lupicinus to order, and reminded him of the emperor's promises. But the Roman count ignored his requests. He felt he could act with impunity and continued to line his pockets, unaware that he was sitting on a powder keg. The tension grew with each passing day. The climax came with an incident in the city of Marcianopolis. Lupicinus, still trying to maintain the appearance of control, invited Fritigern and other Gothic leaders to a banquet. This was a standard Roman reception, a demonstration of hospitality and power. However, it was a trap. While the leaders feasted in the palace, Roman soldiers were to deal with their personal guards, who remained outside the walls. However, the Gothic warriors were no pushovers. They put up fierce resistance. The noise of the battle reached the banquet hall. Fritigern realized that he had been betrayed. He and his comrades, drawing their hidden weapons, fought their way out of the palace and managed to escape from the city. reuniting with their people. Lupitinus's betrayal was the last straw. The Goths' patience had run out. Fritigern, who had tried until the last moment to find a peaceful solution, now took the path of open rebellion. He declared war not on the Roman Empire, but on its corrupt representatives who had deceived his people. The uprising broke out instantly. The Goths, many of whom had kept their weapons, attacked the Roman garrisons. They were immediately joined by another group of Goths, the Grevinghi, whom the Romans had tried to keep out of the empire altogether, but were unable to hold back. Soon the entire province of Thrace was engulfed in flames. The Roman eagle was humiliated, and the province was in the hands of an angry people.
The legions fall.
But how did the Goths, who were refugees, so quickly turn into an organized army? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret of their military machine, which came as a surprise to the Roman legions. What I am about to show you is something the Romans had never seen on such a scale before. It was a military innovation that turned a nomadic people into an impregnable force. When the Goths rebelled, they did not set out to capture cities. They had a better tactic, one that was perfectly suited to their way of life. That tactic was the Wagenburg, a mobile fortress made of carts. The term Wagenburg literally means wagon castle. It was not just a collection of carts, but a complex and well-thought-out defensive system. The entire population, warriors, their families, all their possessions, moved around on thousands of heavy carts. In case of danger, these carts were instantly arranged in a huge circle or square, linked together with chains and wheel-to-wheel. For the Roman army, accustomed to dealing with either cities that could be besieged or armies in open fields, the wagon fort became a real headache. It was a fortress that appeared out of nowhere and could disappear overnight. It could not be stormed without enormous losses, as the carts formed a high and sturdy wall. Behind this wall, the Gothic warriors could fight in ideal conditions. They were protected from Roman arrows and javelins, while showering the attackers with a hail of projectiles. There were narrow passages between the carts, which became deadly traps for anyone who tried to break through. But the Wagenburg was not just a defensive structure. It was a command center, a supply depot, and, most importantly, a home. Inside this circle were not only soldiers, but also their loved ones. This gave the Goths incredible motivation. They were not just fighting for victory, they were fighting for their families, who were right behind them. This tactic gave Fritigern a huge strategic advantage. He was not tied to any one point on the map. His army was completely mobile. He could choose where and when to engage in battle, and when to simply break camp and escape pursuit. The Roman legions, burdened with heavy baggage trains, simply could not keep up with him. For almost 2 years, from 376 to 378, the Goths moved around Thrace, using the wagon fort as their base. They raided Roman villas and small settlements, obtaining food and weapons. The Roman commanders sent against them by Valens proved powerless. They could pursue the Goths, but they could not force them into a decisive battle. The Romans, with their highly developed siege technology, could not use it against the wagon fort. Battering rams and siege towers were useless against a mobile camp that could simply move to a new location. And attacking this fortress of carts head-on was tantamount to suicide, as several unsuccessful skirmishes proved. Moreover, the Wagenburg served as a psychological weapon. It was a constant moving reproach to Roman authority. A huge mobile camp full of hostile warriors roamed the empire with impunity, demonstrating the powerlessness of the legions to all. This undermined the emperor's authority and inspired other discontented people. It was this Wagenburg that would become the focal point of the upcoming battle at Adrianople. Fritigern used it as an anchor, a solid foothold against which the waves of Roman attacks would break. The Romans fatally underestimated this barbaric tactic, considering it primitive. This mobile fortress became the key to the survival of the Goths, and a tactical advantage that the Romans could not figure out. If you find such tactical tricks fascinating, like this video. What if everything you were taught about Roman emperors is incomplete? Emperor Valens was neither a fool nor a tyrant, but one of his flaws proved fatal to the empire. It was a combustible mixture of self-doubt and arrogance. When news of the Gothic uprising and Lupicanus's disgrace reached him in Antioch, he was furious. It was a personal challenge to his authority. Valens was the younger brother of Emperor Valentinian, who ruled the West. All his life, he had been overshadowed by his more successful and charismatic brother. Valentinian was a great soldier, while Valens was more of an administrator. Now that his brother had died, Valens desperately needed a great victory of his own to assert his authority. The Gothic uprising was not just a military problem for him, but a chance to prove to everyone that he was a true Roman emperor, capable of crushing the barbarians. He interrupted the protracted war with Persia by concluding a hasty peace and gathered the entire field army of the Eastern Empire. These were the best legions, a battle-hardened veteran guard. He personally led this army to Thrace. Meanwhile, his young nephew, Emperor Gratian, ruled in the West. Unlike his uncle, Gratian had already made a name for himself. He had just won a brilliant victory over the Germanic tribe of the Alemanni in Gaul. Upon learning of Valens' problems, Gratian immediately gathered his victorious legions and marched east to help his uncle. This was the key moment. Valens was faced with a choice: wait for Gratian's reinforcements and be guaranteed victory, but share the glory with his nephew, or attack immediately and claim all the glory for himself. For his insecure ego, this choice was agonizing. He envied Gratian's success and did not want the young man to outshine him again. While Valens hesitated in his camp near Adrianople, his advisors were divided. There were experienced commanders, such as Sebastian, who called for caution. They advised waiting for Gratian and not risking the entire army. They proposed waging a war of attrition, blocking the Goths in their camp and starving them out. But there were other voices, court flatterers, who assured the emperor of an easy victory. They said that the Goths were just a crowd of savages who would scatter at the first sight of the imperial eagles. They whispered to Valens that it would be a disgrace to share such easy prey with Gratian. The final straw was a report from Roman intelligence. The scouts had made a fatal mistake in assessing the enemy's numbers. They reported to Valens that Fritigern had only about 10,000 soldiers. In reality, there were several times more Goths. This misinformation strengthened Valens in his decision. Confident in his numerical and qualitative superiority, Valens made a fateful decision. He would not wait for Gratian. He himself would lead the legions into battle and end the Gothic threat with one blow. It would be his triumph, his personal victory, which would forever inscribe his name in history. He did indeed write his name in history, but not at all as he had hoped. The decision was made. On August 9, 378, the Roman army received orders to prepare for battle. What price would the empire pay for this haste and the arrogance of one man? In the next chapter, you will learn how the Roman army, the pride of the Eastern Empire, marched toward its doom. Early in the morning of August 9, 378, trumpets sounded in the Roman camp near Adrianople. Emperor Valens gave the order to march. The soldiers, awakened before dawn, began to gather hastily, leaving their camp and heavy baggage behind. They did not receive a full breakfast and did not have time to refill their water flasks, as the order required immediate departure. The army set out on its march. They had to cover about 12 Roman miles, or almost 19 kilometers, across the Thracian plain, scorched by the August sun. The day promised to be unbearably hot. The soldiers marched in full battle gear. They wore heavy armor and helmets and carried their shields, spears, and a supply of javelins. The march was difficult from the very beginning. The dust kicked up by thousands of feet clogged their lungs and made it difficult to breathe. The scorching sun heated the metal of their armor, turning it into veritable furnaces. The water in their flasks quickly ran out, and the legionaries began to feel agonizing thirst long before they saw the enemy. The Roman army, numbering between 30 and 40,000 men according to various estimates, stretched out along the road. These were the best forces of the East, veterans of the Persian Wars, elite palace troops of the Praetorians and auxiliaries. They were confident in their strength and discipline, but their physical condition was deteriorating with every step. At the same time, the Goths in their wagon fort were well aware of the Romans' approach. Fritigern's scouts watched every move of Valens' army. The Goths rested in the shade of their carts, with plenty of water and food. They waited for their enemy to exhaust themselves. Fritigern also employed a tactical ruse. To further exhaust the Romans and conceal his true strength, he ordered the dry grass in the fields in front of his camp to be set on fire. The acrid smoke flowed towards the Roman army, mixing with the dust. It stung the eyes and made breathing difficult, turning an already grueling march into a real ordeal. Only after midday, having spent more than 7 hours on the road under the scorching sun, did the vanguard of the Roman army finally see their destination. On a gentle hill stood a huge circular camp of wagons, a Wagenburg. The Roman soldiers, exhausted by thirst, hunger, and heat, stopped to catch their breath and form a battle line. The commanders tried to bring order to the stretched-out columns. The cavalry was moved to the flanks, and the heavy infantry was grouped into dense centuries in the center. But the army was already in poor condition. The soldiers were physically and morally exhausted even before the battle began. They looked at the enemy camp, and their confidence began to waver. Valens, who had arrived with the main forces, saw the fatigue of his troops. Perhaps at that moment he regretted his decision not to let his men rest. But it was too late to retreat. That would have been an admission of defeat. He ordered the army to turn around for an immediate assault. The Roman line formed opposite the wagon fort. The left flank of the cavalry was almost ready to attack, while the right flank was still pulling up and trying to take up its positions. Discipline was maintained, but it was at its limit. The legionaries stood in the open sun, drenched in sweat and dreaming of a sip of water. It was at this moment of tactical chaos and physical exhaustion that Fritigern decided to strike his next blow. He did not wait for the Romans to attack. Instead, he used the weapon he had in abundance: time. He decided to wait a little longer to bring the Roman soldiers to complete exhaustion. Want to know the secret that changed the course of the battle before it even began? Fritigern was not only a warrior, but also an unrivaled master of psychological warfare. Seeing that the Roman army was lining up for an attack, he realized he had a serious problem. His best striking force, the heavy cavalry of the Grevthungs under the command of Alatius and Safrak, had not yet returned from foraging. Fritigern could not start the battle without his cavalry. He needed to buy time at any cost. And he made a brilliant move. He began negotiations. Gothic envoys came out of the wagon fort with olive branches. They went to Emperor Valens with an offer of peace. Valens, despite his determination, was puzzled. Perhaps the Goths were frightened by the sight of his army. He agreed to listen to the envoys. Fritigern stalled for time as best he could. He pretended to seek peace and asked for noble Roman hostages to be sent for negotiations to guarantee his safety. The Romans fell for this trick. They began to discuss who to send. Time passed. The Roman army stood in full battle order under the scorching sun. The heat was at its peak. The soldiers who had not eaten since morning were suffering from thirst and heat stroke. Their armor was red hot, and their patience was running out. Meanwhile, Fritigern was not only stalling for time, but also preparing the battlefield. While negotiations were underway, the Goths inside the wagon fortress let out a deafening battle cry, banged on their shields, and shouted threats. This psychological pressure, combined with the heat and fatigue, had a depressing effect on the Romans. They were forced to stand and listen to it, unable to respond. The negotiations dragged on. The Romans sent one dignitary, but Fritigern rejected him, stating that he would only speak with the highest-ranking officials. It was a blatant mockery, but Valens continued to play along. Every hour that his army spent idle in the scorching sun worked in the Goths' favor. Fritigern's tactic was brilliant. He was wearing down the enemy without firing a single shot. He exploited Valens' main weakness, his indecisiveness, which had now replaced his morning arrogance. The emperor could neither order an attack, thereby breaking off the peace negotiations, nor retreat, which would have been tantamount to disgrace. The Roman soldiers, especially on the left flank, which was fully deployed and closest to the wagon fort, were beginning to lose patience. They could see the enemy taunting them from their wagons. Discipline, the foundation of the Roman army, was cracking under the pressure of thirst and humiliation. It is unknown how long Fritigern intended to continue this spectacle. Perhaps he was waiting for a signal from his returning cavalry. But the course of events was interrupted by a chance occurrence, which often decides the outcome of great battles. The patience of one of the Roman units snapped. It was a brilliant ploy that put the Roman army in an unbearable situation. But how long could it last? And what was the spark that ignited the battlefield? In the next chapter, you will learn about the moment when patience ran out and chaos took over strategy. While Fritigern and Valentinus exchanged envoys, a crisis was brewing on the flanks. Tension in the Roman ranks had reached its limit. And then it happened. A small detachment of Roman archers, or according to another version, light infantry, could not hold out. Perhaps they misinterpreted a gesture or simply lost their composure from the heat and provocations. Acting without orders, this unit rushed forward toward the wagon fort. They began showering the carts with arrows and javelins, trying to provoke the Goths into a sortie. This premature and uncoordinated maneuver was the spark that ignited the entire battle. Negotiations were instantly broken off. Seeing that the battle had begun, Cassius, the commander of the Roman cavalry on the left flank, decided that this was a general signal to attack. He could not allow his infantry units to fight alone. He led his squadrons in an attack on the wagon fort. The cavalry rushed forward, trying to bypass the camp and find a breach in it. The attack on the left flank set the entire army in motion. Now Valens could no longer hold back his troops. The central line of heavy infantry, the heart of the Roman army, began its slow, laborious climb up the hill toward the enemy camp. The Battle of Adrianople had begun, but it did not begin according to the emperor's plan, but as a spontaneous, chaotic reaction. The Roman cavalry on the left flank initially achieved some success. They pushed back the Gothic warriors outside the camp and came close to the wagons. But here an unpleasant surprise awaited them. The wagon fort was impregnable to a cavalry attack. The defenders behind the carts showered them with a hail of arrows and spears. Meanwhile, the Roman infantry, stepping on the scorched grass, slowly closed the distance. They walked up the slope, breathing heavily under their helmet masks. The Goths inside the camp met them with fury. They fought with the desperation of people defending their families. The Roman legionaries, despite their fatigue, responded with their famous discipline. A fierce battle broke out near the carts. The Romans tried to pull the carts apart and cut their way inside. The Goths fought back desperately. For a while, the Roman pressure seemed about to break the resistance. The legionnaires were experienced fighters, and their onslaught was terrifying. The right flank of the Roman cavalry, which had not yet fully deployed, also joined the battle. However, their attack was disjointed. They were unable to coordinate their actions with the infantry. The entire Roman army was drawn into a heavy frontal assault on a fortified position, which was conducted under the most unfavorable conditions. Valens and his staff lost control of the battle the moment it began. There was no unified plan, no reserves. The entire army was thrown into battle at once. This was exactly what Fritigern could not have hoped for. The Romans exhausted themselves and were now bogged down in a futile assault on his fortress. It was at this critical moment, when the entire Roman army was tied up in battle, its flanks exposed and its soldiers completely exhausted, that a huge cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Fritigern had waited. His main force was returning. The battle was entering its decisive and most terrible phase. At the moment when the Roman army was completely absorbed in the assault on the wagon fort, a new force descended upon the battlefield. It was the Gothic heavy cavalry of the Greutungs under the command of Alatius and Safrak. They were returning from foraging and, seeing that their camp was under attack, immediately rushed into battle. They struck at full gallop, like lightning, at the most vulnerable part of the Roman army, the right flank. The Roman cavalry on the right flank, which was already disorganized and exhausted, did not expect such a blow. The heavily armored Gothic horsemen, fresh and fierce, literally crushed them. Ammianus Marcellinus, the chief historian of this battle, described this attack as a thunderbolt falling from the high mountains. The Roman cavalry was overturned and fled the battlefield in panic. They did not even attempt to regroup. This retreat marked the beginning of the end for Valens' entire army. With the defeat of the right-wing cavalry, the flank of the Roman heavy infantry was completely exposed. The Gothic horsemen, without stopping, turned around and struck the legionaries in the flank and rear. At the same time, encouraged by the return of the cavalry, Fritigern gave the order for a general sortie from the wagon fort. The Gothic infantry, which had been successfully defending itself until then, now poured out from behind the wagons and struck the Romans head-on. The legions found themselves in a classic cannons situation. They were caught in a pincer movement. Fritigern's infantry attacked them from the front, while Alatea and Safraka's cavalry trampled and cut them down from the flank and rear. The situation became catastrophic for the Roman infantry. Their famous tortoise formation was useless. They were so tightly packed together that they could neither maneuver nor even use their weapons effectively. They became static targets. In the chaos, friendly units became mixed up, and command was completely lost. The heat, thirst, and fatigue now multiplied the effect of the Gothic attack. Soldiers who could barely stand could not resist their fresh and fierce opponents. The long spears of the Gothic horsemen easily reached the legionaries, while the short Roman gladius swords were useless in such a crush. The Roman left flank, which had initially advanced the furthest, was now cut off from the main forces. Seeing the defeat of the right flank and the flight of the cavalry, the soldiers realized that the battle was lost. Panic ensued. The discipline that had held the legions together for centuries evaporated in an instant. The soldiers threw down their heavy shields and tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. The Gothic cavalry methodically surrounded the scattered groups of Romans, preventing them from escaping. The battlefield turned into a huge cauldron in which the best army of the Eastern Roman Empire was crushed. It was a complete and utter defeat. The Goths' victory was not just tactical, it was crushing. They did not simply defeat the Romans, they destroyed them. The Roman military doctrine, based on the superiority of heavy infantry, suffered a complete collapse in the face of a new force, heavy cavalry. The outcome of this battle was a foregone conclusion. What had once begun as an organized and strategically planned battle turned into the complete and merciless annihilation of the Roman army. The soldiers caught in a deadly circle had absolutely no chance of survival. The dense mass of heavily armed men, unable to retreat or defend themselves effectively, became an easy target for the enemy. It was not just a defeat, but a catastrophe, the scale of which will long remain in memory as one of the most tragic pages in the history of Rome. The losses were not just great, they were catastrophic for the entire army. Historians who have studied this battle give a terrifying estimate. On that day, the Roman army lost up to 2/3 of its total strength. This meant the death of 20,000 to 30,000 elite soldiers, professionals, each of whom was not only an experienced fighter, but also part of a powerful military machine. Among the dead were not only ordinary legionaries, but also the highest command, which was at the heart of the battle. 35 tribunes, dozens of prefects and comites, including the renowned commander Sebastian, were left lying on the battlefield, as if symbolizing an irreparable loss. As a result of these deaths, the Roman Empire lost not only its main army, but also its entire officer corps, whose experience had been formed over many decades. These losses were absolutely irreparable. It was impossible to make up for them, which meant the virtual destruction of the strategic and tactical potential of the Eastern Roman Empire. After this battle, the empire was on the brink of disaster. These events became the moment from which the Eastern Empire would never recover, and it is unlikely that it will ever be able to restore its lost power and ability to resist. However, the most terrible loss of that day was the disappearance of Emperor Valens himself, who was never found. The fate of Emperor Valens, who lost his army overnight, remains one of the greatest mysteries in history. His disappearance has given rise to many theories. According to one of them, he was surrounded along with his detachment of elite guards who defended their lord to the last. But the enemy forces were so overwhelming that the Roman emperor fell in battle like a simple soldier, and his body was never found. His death remains unexplained, and it has become one of the most tragic pages in the history of Rome. There is another version, more dramatic and tragic. According to this legend, Valens was seriously wounded by an arrow during his retreat. His loyal bodyguards, desperately trying to save the emperor, carried him to the nearest village estate or watchtower to bandage his wound. There, amid the ruins and destruction, several other surviving soldiers took refuge. However, the Goths, who were pursuing the fleeing Romans, soon surrounded the building. They did not know that the emperor himself was hiding there. When they tried to storm it, the Roman soldiers put up fierce resistance, firing from the windows. Seeing that they could not take the fortress head-on, the Goths decided to resort to another tactic, setting fire to the wooden structure. The fire engulfed the building, and everyone inside burned alive. This could have been the emperor himself, and possibly several of his closest advisors. According to this version, Valens did not even receive a proper burial. His death in the fire became a symbol of how the entire army of the Eastern Roman Empire burned in flames, and how the mighty power of the empire disappeared overnight. This tragedy was the moment when the Eastern Roman Empire lost not only its army, but also its soul, its confidence in its invincibility. When night fell, the battle was over. For many of those who survived, the night brought only the last painful memories of a terrible defeat. Only a few, including part of the defeated cavalry, managed to escape under cover of darkness and bring the terrible news. The remaining soldiers who failed to break through either died on the battlefield or were taken prisoner. The losses were so great that this defeat was considered a catastrophe comparable only to that which occurred at Cannae, when Hannibal crushed the Roman army 6 centuries earlier. But Adrianople turned out to be much worse. For Rome, Adrianople was not just a military defeat, but a tragedy whose consequences could not be immediately grasped. While Rome lost its army at Cannae but was able to recover and continue fighting, after the Battle of Adrianople, the empire lost not only its army but also the ability to quickly gather new forces. The professional corps, which had been formed over decades, was wiped out in just one day. Rome was left defenseless. This was all the more tragic because Rome had always prided itself on its army, which was the best in the world. The Goths, intoxicated by victory, immediately marched on Constantinople. However, despite their victory, they were unable to capture the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, as its walls were too strong for their siege efforts. Nevertheless, the entire Balkan Peninsula and all of Thrace were now in the hands of the barbarians. The Goths became masters of the situation, and their influence in the region continued for many years. This battle was not only a military defeat for Rome, but also a psychological shock. The belief in the invincibility of the Roman legion, which was the foundation of all imperial power, was destroyed. Now everyone knew that the legions of Rome, considered impenetrable, could be defeated. Now everyone understood that the empire could be brought to its knees, and it was not only the Goths who saw this. The defeat at Adrianople on August 9, 378, proved disastrous for the Roman Empire, not only from a military but also from a political point of view. In an instant, the army was virtually destroyed. Emperor Valens was killed, and the capital, Constantinople, was threatened with siege. This battle demonstrated the superiority of the Gothic cavalry over the Roman legions, and even the best strategists of Rome could not have avoided disaster in such circumstances. After Emperor Valens died, the young Gratian, emperor of the Western Roman Empire, found himself in a hopeless situation. He could not rule both halves of the empire at the same time, and therefore decided to appoint a new co-ruler for the East.
The balance of power is
This was Theodosius, an experienced Spanish general who was proclaimed Emperor of the East in 379. Theodosius faced an almost impossible task: to restore order without an army, since the only forces that could have held back the Gothic raids had already been destroyed. Theodosius made a decision that forever changed the fate of Rome and its relations with the barbarians. In 382, he concluded a peace treaty with the Goths, in which the Goths became federates, allies of Rome. This step was historic, as barbarians had never been granted such status before. Theodosius allowed the Goths to settle in the empire, in the province of Moesia, and to preserve their traditions, leaders, and, most importantly, their weapons. They became a virtually independent army that served Rome, but was not part of the Roman army. Thus, the empire began to buy off the barbarians, granting them land and rights to avoid further conflict. This peace treaty was a fateful step that allowed the barbarians not only to remain within the empire, but also to strengthen their position within its borders. This moment became a turning point in the history of Rome. Instead of assimilating the barbarian peoples, Rome was now forced to accept their presence and their becoming part of the Roman system. This set a precedent that would later play a key role in weakening the empire, turning Rome into an unstable state in which the barbarians were no longer foreign elements, but full-fledged participants. The military lessons learned at Adrianople also had a serious impact on the organization of the Roman army. The Battle of Adrianople demonstrated the complete superiority of heavy cavalry over infantry. The Roman army began to gradually change. The era of legions, which had dominated the battlefields for over 1,000 years, was coming to an end. From this moment on, a new era began, the era of heavily armed horsemen, which would lead to the formation of knighthood in the Middle Ages.
Form ranks on the double.
The Goths themselves, who settled in the territory of Rome, did not remain loyal allies for long. Alaric, a young warrior who participated in the Battle of Adrianople, learned an important lesson. Rome was no longer omnipotent. When Rome tried to limit the rights of the Goths or deceive them, Alaric led a rebellion. This revolt eventually brought him to the walls of Rome in 410, where the Goths, in their final act of revenge, sacked the Eternal City, an event that shook the entire ancient world. Thus, the defeat at Adrianople was not just a military defeat. It was a prologue to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Rome, trying to cope with the threat, was forced to accept barbarians on its territory, which only weakened it over time. As a result, Rome was unable to maintain its power and lost control of its territories. This led to the barbarization of the army, the loss of key lands, and ultimately, the destruction of the entire western part of the Roman Empire. The legion that had once created a powerful empire was unable to protect it from destruction. On August 9, 378, Rome met its fate, and this date became a turning point in history. From that moment on, a new era began. The Middle Ages, born on the dusty field near Adrianople under the blows of the Gothic cavalry. Although Eastern Rome continued to exist for another 1,000 years, the western part was doomed to fall. The Battle of Adrianople was not the end of Rome, but it was a point of no return, the beginning of the end of its western half. It was a cruel lesson that the empire never fully learned, that despair is a stronger motivator than discipline, and that no army can be invincible forever. This battle showed that the future belonged not to heavy infantry, but to a new, swift force, heavy cavalry. History is full of such turning points that have shaped our present. What other great battles or tactical decisions do you think deserve separate analysis? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next episodes.